Hello and welcome to the Decent Ideas podcast, where decent needn't necessarily mean polite in an indecent time, nor should it mean perfect for obvious reasons. What it must mean is fitting and suitable to that time. I'm Terence. For this first podcast, I wanted to start just by giving you a little intro into me and who I am. I'm what you might call a recovering software entrepreneur in product and project management, where I helped lead and support 3 teams to build applications in conversational artificial intelligence and blockchain. One's intellectual property was acquired and 2 reached Series A funding. I've lived on 3 continents, including a stint in a Central African country called Cameroon, which is now consumed in civil war. I live with pre-existing conditions, including permanent soft tissue damage and chronic pain in my back from a car accident beyond my control, and damage to my stomach and kidneys stemming in part from the anxiety and stress of surviving chronic sexual assault by one person. I currently wait tables in the North Shore of Massachusetts, and I spent the first half of my childhood in Boulder, Colorado, the second half in a small, quiet town outside of Boulder. My educational background is an undergraduate degree in international studies and 2 years graduate study in linguistics. And that's about it in terms of what's worth knowing about me for now, just to show you kind of how I perceive the world. As an introvert, I'm used to working behind the scenes, so talking to a camera with no social or verbal cues as to whether I'm being understood is a fresh challenge for me, but I've got a background that amounts to systems thinking across a couple of disciplines, in particular focused on designing good user experiences in software. So with that in mind, if we start to think of interactions in our society as a set of software problems with some established attempted solutions that have either worked or not worked, we have something of a paradigm to work from that not all established figures in the media space share. So with that, I wanted to do a cold open or cold start to this podcast by reflecting on some recent ideas that didn't come to fruition. One was a decent idea, which some believed to be not very decent, that unfortunately didn't gain traction. One was a really bad idea that got a lot closer to succeeding than it should have. Both of these ideas at least started mostly online, until they weren't just online anymore. And the transition from online to offline had different results. But they're very illustrative, I think, of 2 forces attempting to exert power in American society outside of government. So those 2 are hashtag force the vote and another hashtag that I won't name for various reasons, but it begins with stop and ends with steal. So let's start by talking about hashtag force the vote. Force the Vote began with a particular ask that progressives in the House withhold their vote for Speaker Pelosi in the new Congress in exchange for a floor vote on Medicare for All. This idea was popularized by Jimmy Dore. A lot of people, outside of the web don't know about this, so if you don't, this was popularized by Jimmy Dore and a subset of leftists and independent media, as well as a third-party movement called the People's Party. And it was dissented against by several other, perhaps more prominent leftists and independent media, which could be argued as the reason, or a part of the reason, why it was kind of drowned out in the discourse, especially when progressives in Congress themselves, most prominently Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of the Squad, dissented against it. So I supported the vote. I supported Force the Vote, primarily because it struck me as a way to shake up the status quo in our government at a time when we seemed intent on going back to sleep or back to brunch, as some have put it. This was an opportunity to exert leftist power during a transition where, as it happened for a number of reasons, there was a very slim majority for Democrats in the House of Representatives, in our representative government. And so there was finally sort of an opportunity to leverage progressive power, at least in theory, and say, we can't allow people to go back to sleep. We can't allow people to just go back to brunch. We've got to take this opportunity when, in the middle of a pandemic, a once in 100-year pandemic, at least until the next one, right? We have an opportunity to move forward in discussion about universal health care, which you'll come to find is a particular concern of mine, and in the work that I'm trying to do here. In any event, so this is sort of the groundwork, right? And like I say, this is a discourse that happened very much online, and I don't want to go too much into kind of the details of what happened, but I think it's important to talk about, at the very least, where it ended up, right? So at the end of the day, this ended up being a divisive issue, and not necessarily because the issue at hand itself was particularly divisive, but because sort of two positions were kind of established very early on, that basically were ended up being very personal, very much about a certain group of people. If you follow me on Twitter at decentfed PROJ, you'll see me having discussed this, over time. This phenomenon where it seems that people on the left, in particular online, can be more concerned about being perceived as the smartest person in the room, right? Being perceived as the person that everyone else should get behind. Strong personalities, shall we say. And as a result, problems like this, and I think this was endemic of this issue, was this sense that, this is the only way to go forward, and if you don't follow this, then you're wrong or bad or evil. Like I say, I supported Force the Vote because it struck me as the right way to, at the very least, demonstrate where progressive power begins and ends in the current political environment, which is to say it's not very large, but it is nevertheless pivotal, and able to make some impact. But at the same time, I've worked very hard to kind of see both sides of this, right? And this is actually pretty well illustrated by the debate most recently between Sam Cedar of the Majority Report and Brianna Joy Gray of the Bad Faith podcast. And I managed to get through some 3 hours of this debate, and left it kind of thinking, okay, we had a real sort of solid, if contentious at sometimes, discourse about how do we build the left going forward, right, from this moment? How do we reflect on where this moment leaves us, as obviously, Speaker Pelosi was not overwhelmingly, I should say, was elected Speaker for what she has said is to be her last term. And so there you have it. So she was elected. So effectively, there was no more room to withhold a vote for Speaker when the vote has already been cast. I should also add, by the way, that this started obviously as withholding a vote for Speaker Pelosi in exchange for a floor vote for Medicare for All, but it also was broadened by several figures in progressive media to basically say, let's withhold our vote for a number of things. Let's withhold our vote for committee positions within Congress. Let's withhold our vote for emergency Medicare for All in the pandemic. Let's withhold our vote for $2,000 checks. Let's withhold our vote for a $15 minimum wage. Let's withhold our vote for anything that you can think of, right? And obviously, how big the list gets makes it that much more of a big ask to say, give us all these things or we won't vote for you. but it's meant to be, a place of beginning the bargaining, right? Beginning the bargain for how to move forward. And so, as I was saying, so Brianna Joy Gray and Sam Cedar, engaged in a live stream to discuss this. Like I said, about 3 hours before Sam Cedar signed off. And I left that discourse thinking that it was very productive and sort of tied a bow around this. So a couple of points that I think were particularly sort of germane. First, from Brianna, the idea that PAYGO exception. So PAYGO is this system that basically says if you want to pass new spending, you have to find a way to do it such that it doesn't increase the deficit. Basically, it has to be paid for before you can go forward with it. And so, what appears to have been extracted, whether it was leveraged for the Pelosi vote or not, we don't know, was PAYGO exceptions for healthcare and other items related to the pandemic, as well as beyond the pandemic items related to addressing climate change. And Brianna's point, which I think is absolutely spot on, is that if this was it, that this was insufficient. With any luck, the pandemic will be resolved, or at least dampened in terms of its effects within the course of the year, and then what, right? You don't have as much leverage at that point to move the discussion forward on healthcare. So in some cases, in some senses, it's basically done. The leverage is spent, and there's no more gain. So one of her big points that I really responded to was this idea that this is really an insufficient get, if this is the only get. And the other prominent point that came from the other side, from Sam Cedar's side, was essentially about the degree to which leftist power exists. And basically his argument was the left doesn't have a lot of power, either in media or otherwise, to be divided as a group or to create new divisions over strategy, such as this strategy. And I think that's right. I think that obviously this did create a major rift, as I say, between those who support force the vote and those who don't, with those who support force the vote referring to, in many cases, referring to the squad as the quote-unquote fraud squad. There's another hashtag online, and basically saying if you don't agree to this, if you're not on board with this, then you don't support what we're trying to do, and you're frauds, effectively. And this was I think, damaging. And by the way, I think there are a lot of people on the force the vote side that have since come out and said this is going too far, saying that, oh, just because they don't support this one strategy, they're frauds. But the net effect was that this particular narrative was emboldened, what grew rapidly, trended online, and so ultimately a pretty negative, and I'd argue not very constructive approach. So Sam Cedar's point then, as I was saying, was let us not be so divided or create new divisions over what amounts to one particular strategy, and basically saying that there must be other strategies that these lawmakers are pursuing in order to advance important progressive goals like Medicare for all. And the fact is, there's only you can probably count the number of truly progressive, of strongly progressive lawmakers on 3 hands or so. And so that's not really a lot of power to leverage, unfortunately. But what it does do, again, so sort of going to the positive, what it does do is it shows that progressives are not perhaps particularly well represented in Congress, and that perhaps they should be, right? So the argument being that if the floor vote were held, it would show just how few support this and would empower potential candidates to run to primary these folks and create new openings for leftist, for progressive power. And that's good. And I think this is one thing that hasn't perhaps come out in the discourse about this, which is I think we have to consider agendas, right? I think we have to acknowledge that everyone approaches debates like these with an agenda, with a direction that they want to go. And I also happen to believe in the power of third parties to move the discourse. And so one of the groups that kind of picked up hashtag force the vote and ran with it was the People's Party. And basically, ultimately they were one of those that also publicized the fraud squad hashtag, if I remember correctly. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But that, basically pushed really hard for force the vote. And I happen to believe that this is largely in part, and there's some reporting that's come out that basically suggests that this was about demonstrating that working within the Democratic Party was a losing strategy, and that this move was doomed to fail, and as a result would push people towards third parties, towards the People's Party. Now, this isn't to say that this is a bad agenda. It's just to say that it's important to recognize what the agendas are and take that into account when evaluating where you stand. So for my part, you'll find as we move forward with this podcast that I have an agenda too, right? And so I support force the vote for my own set of reasons. And I'll just tease at it, which is to say that basically, yeah, if this was sort of doomed to fail in the sense that a floor vote for Medicare for all would not lead to it being passed into law, quite obviously. And in my view, this demonstrates just how little power progressives and leftists have and gives an opportunity to broaden the discourse about how we grow that power. So I'll leave that piece where it is. But I'd also say a lot of this is about, in my mind, and Ryan Knight, he goes by Proud Socialist at Proud Socialist on Twitter, someone that I've followed and respected a lot, although I don't share his socialist label. I consider myself a left libertarian, which I'll talk about shortly. But he has sort of come out and tried to strike this balance while also being a very strong and vocal, perhaps adversarial voice about force the vote, has talked a lot about the importance of progressive solidarity on the left, and being able to basically have an inside-outside strategy for pursuing progressive goals, for pursuing let's just call it what it really is, right? Not just progressive goals, but goals that move us towards progress, right? And I look forward to that ongoing discourse and hope to continue to participate in it and hopefully through this podcast contribute to it. But ultimately, I think where we come down on this is that though I am a supporter of force the vote, or it was, given that it's no longer the strategy for the reasons I've already outlined, I believe that ultimately it did divide the left in a negative way. So like I said, Sam Cedar talking about the limits in the amount of progressive or leftist power that exists. I do agree ultimately with Sam's argument that there's not much power to begin with, except media power, except social media power in particular, for the squad, for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for Rashida Tlaib, for Ilhan Omar, for now Cori Bush, for Nina Turner as she runs for Congress in 2022. But ultimately, there are no assurances that establishment moves to quash, these movements wouldn't negate any potential upsides just by virtue of the fact that the power is so limited. And as I've already said, a divided left is probably something I don't believe we can afford at this stage if we're to really bring lasting change and success. So that's ultimately where I come down on force the vote, and I hope that that's a measured, balanced perspective that perhaps you wouldn't find many other places, and hopefully that contributes to the discourse. And so, with that, I'd like to pursue the second hashtag that begins with stop and ends with steal, as I think I've said. So this was the move, obviously, to on the right. So we talked about the left, right? This is a movement on the right to basically claim that the election was fraudulent. So it was championed by our now former president, Donald Trump. And this is where we're at. Is this movement was upheld by a couple of senators, a number of Congress people. I believe it was 140 that in the House that supported the move to basically overturn the election results. And ultimately, what did this culminate in? And it culminated in, who knows what the name will be in the history books, but the riots on Capitol Hill and in the Congress building. And there are some analogies to be drawn, right, to what happened with Force the Vote. The idea of stopping the steal began with the president using his online presence to advocate for this. It was germinated online by numerous groups, including far right and including white supremacist groups, like the Proud Boys, like the Three Percenters, like the Boogaloo Boys. And by contrast to Force the Vote, when this moved offline, we know how it resulted. It resulted in a number of deaths, a couple of deaths, shall we say, whereas Force the Vote, by contrast, was a protest on Capitol Hill, but unfortunately was pretty sparsely attended. Unfortunately, said unfortunately twice there, because I think it is deeply unfortunate that there wasn't more momentum behind this move. So let's get a little bit more into kind of the parallels here and what I think this says. Obviously neither movement succeeded. Both have now kind of returned to the online space, if you will, and both have splintered their relative corners. I think it's fair to say, at least in the online sphere, the left is now deeply divided over how to push our representatives in Congress, and on the right, there's no doubt about it. There's deep divides between whether Donald Trump is the right figure, the right leader for that group, whether the riots in fact were a good move, a prudent action. Hopefully it's clear where I stand on that this was a move against democracy. And, we had a very similar vote outcome. I believe it was the same number of electoral votes, breaking, but in the opposite direction in 2016. And we who didn't want to see Donald Trump in the White House, shall we say, didn't storm the Capitol to oppose it. Perhaps some of us called for, yours truly included, for faithless electors to challenge the result, for other sort of more procedural moves. But, we called for it in perhaps a, hate this word choice, but more civil way. And so where does this leave us? So like I say, the right is now also divided on this question of who's the right champions, right? And what is the right way forward? I would argue that both are probably pretty equally unclear about what the next step is. And, on the right, we're seeing murmurings that the president might start a third party, and all indications are that a strong majority of his followers, at least in the present moment, would follow him to a third party, would fracture the Republican Party perhaps irrevocably, and would probably lead to them losing, more elections in the future by dividing their caucus. And the question is, are we experiencing something similar on the left with the fallout from Force the Vote, albeit from a place that hasn't had power in a much longer period of time, right? It's not looking bright, shall we say, on either the left wing or the right wing of the country. And that is, I don't know, it struck me that this was an important kind of group of things to discuss together. Like I say, I agree with one, I don't agree with the other. But we live in a world where there isn't much room for dissent, right? And it's worth stating that now we're in a spot where the middle is winning, right? And this might be a new perspective for some, but the fact is the Democratic Party in this country is a centrist party. It's not a left party. It's not a right party. It's a centrist party. And that is reflected in the way that we're proceeding forward. And so as I mentioned before, so I consider myself a left libertarian. What that means is I care about liberty, I care about equity, I care about security, and I care about all three things in kind of equal measure. And that puts me more in line with the Green Party, perhaps, and to probably a much lesser extent, the Libertarian Party, than it does put me with the Democratic Party or the GOP. But when we talk about, progressive goals, I generally am in favor of a lot of those progressive goals. Medicare for all, this major turning point of the Force the Vote, to be one of them. As I said before, Medicare for all is about universal health care. It's about making healthcare much cheaper and usable by anyone, regardless of socioeconomic status. And we are miles away from this. And at the end of the day, when I look at these two movements, one thing I think that in my short life, my life experience has taught me is that you can't work with those who are unwilling to work with you. It has something to do with consent as applied to deal making. And I don't claim to know all the answers, but what I'll be trying to build with this podcast is a framework around thinking through conflict and through diversities of opinion to build new societal approaches that accommodate and even operationalize our differences. So with that, I'll leave you for today saying, next time we'll discuss a different way to structure the U.S. system of governance. As I've said, the best way to reach me is on Twitter at DecentFed, Decent Fed Project. And for now, I'll say farewell and be decent to one another. Thanks for listening.